Thank you, Riley. So there's a recording from the previous session that we did, which was the same exact thing that I'm going through now. And then this is recording, so we can get that done as well. And then as we go along, I'll offer additional resourcing for training as well. Thank you. All right, so where we're headed tonight. This is the map, the road map that we're on. We'll talk a little bit about the overview purpose for monitoring, where to find the resources, and then we're going to go through some of those resources in detail. The guide in particular as the most important foundational document, and then the articulate, which we'll talk about more, and then the Word documents that you'll use for monitoring, and then we'll have a time for question and answers along the way. So in case you were wondering what monitoring is, in short, it helps us better understand the barriers and challenges that prevent equity and equality between all persons. While G. Cosro's work is focused on gender and women, of course, that means we have to be paying attention to everyone involved because gender is only one part of who we are as humans, right? And so we have the scope of work to monitor, which means gathering data and information from the people that are making up the United Methodist Church in all of the ways at all the levels. And so having a process for monitoring, which is that gathering of information, is a formality that helps us keep our ducks in a row, helps us better understand what the data looks like, helps us learn what the gaps are, where we're doing well, how we've improved over time, and all of those possibilities. In the past, you may have been familiar with monitoring in ways that you've seen perhaps at general conference or jurisdictional or regional conferences, as well as in annual conferences. And the best example that you may have seen is someone standing up at a microphone and introducing themselves, such as, I'm Reverend Katrena King. I am a deacon from the Louisiana Annual Conference. I am an Asian female young adult. And I would like to speak on blah, blah, blah thing. And so you may have seen this happening at all levels of the church from the microphone. And sometimes the monitoring piece can get a little heavy because we have a lot of people sharing information about themselves and we're tracking that information, aggregating it, doing maps and graphs and percentages and all kinds of fun stuff along the way. And when I came on board as the new director of monitoring and resource development, I wanted to strike a balance between the technical data and numbers, as well as the storytelling narrative piece of what this looks like, because one over the other is not always great. And when we have one that can inform the other, it helps our storytelling become better, it helps our work become more memorable, and it helps us move forward and have guide points and goalposts to reach along the way. And so, as we go tonight, what does monitoring look like moving forward? You may be familiar with the way we've done it in the past. We've kept some of those pieces, but we've also tried to get creative in expanding the way that we do this, understanding that we have a worldwide church and that our reach looks a little bit different, our words look a little bit different, and our contexts look a little different. So, one of the most important parts of monitoring in this new phase is the adaptability and contextual pieces that we bring alongside that. And so today's goal is to provide you a high level overview and understanding of the resources that are available to you. And you can take those and become more familiar with them. And then we can do additional trainings after that. But first things first, where to find the resources. You can find this on the gcosro.org website. Kelly, if you don't mind dropping that in the chat for me. GCosro has a monitoring toolkit on that website. And so if you go there and you click on it, you'll have access to the documents we're going to be walking through tonight, the articulate, which is a self-paced training, as well as other resources around monitoring that might be helpful to you. And so you can look for this logo on the homepage or on our website, and that should get you there. And I see that my colleague has dropped this in the chat for you. Okay, so I mentioned there's several parts to what this looks like. I developed what's called the How-To Guide to Monitoring, which exists as a PDF document that's a number of pages long, and it walks you through a bunch of different things. We'll show you in the table of contents shortly, but it is something that you can click through pretty easily. You can print it out, you can mark it up, whatever makes sense for you. So this is the first piece of the puzzle. And so here you can see what that table of contents looks like. And we're going to walk through each of these sections together so you understand what its purpose is, how to use each part, and what that looks like. So just quickly, how to use this guide, a refresher on GCSRW's mandate and purpose for monitoring, a timeline to help you prepare for monitoring based on the information you receive and when you receive it, some foundational definitions to help put name to some of the things you might experience along the way, what we're monitoring for, how to do the monitoring, and then best practices for gathering and sharing information. And then there's more information about how to get training for monitoring. And one of those things is what you're doing right now. And then there's an appendix with all of the documents that you need to print out there. And we will just go ahead and dive into what this looks like in practice. So I'm going to be clicking on slides, but if you're looking at the PDF, for example, you're just scrolling up as we go. So what's the purpose of this how-to guide to monitoring? Monitoring can be done at any administrative and programmatic function of the United Methodist Church. And I'll tell you the pro tip is that that's pretty much anywhere that we're doing business as a church. And so where there are people gathering or there's decision making going on, you can be monitoring, whether that's in a super formal sense or an informal observational sense. Now, this toolkit is guided towards mid to large size meetings. When I say that, I mean maybe legislative committees, maybe your annual conference, maybe larger than that. But as I mentioned, this adaptability piece, you can utilize monitoring for whatever size group you're with. You can just scale your number of people up or down and do trainings as makes sense for your context. And again, we're highlighting this balance of demographic tracking, data, numbers, technical things, along with storytelling and things that you hear and see from people along the way. And so we touched on this a little bit, but in addition to our mandate of challenging the church, GCSRW is tasked with the function of being a monitor for those programmatic and administrative functions of the church. So that does mean gathering number, gathering data, whatever format that looks like, making recommendations based on the things that we learn, and also giving some guidelines for how to eradicate discrimination along the way, not just against women, but against all people. And monitoring helps us understand what those challenges and barriers are that prevents that equity, that equality between all persons. GCSRW does have some things that it likes to lay out as we lean into this work of monitoring. For example, we affirm that all persons are equal creations of God, made in God's image and worthy of God's blessing, and therefore they should all be included and accepted in the full life of the church. We also affirm that when we need to seek expert advice from people, whether laity or clergy or anybody else that has gifts or talents, these experts should be sought from a diversity of backgrounds based on education, knowledge, experience, rather than stereotypes that we think we know about people. And all members throughout the full life of the church should have opportunities to serve in varying types of ways. And alongside monitoring, we also have work relating to expansive and inclusive language for people and for God. So, not just referring to people by pronouns, particularly, or God by pronouns, but about the way they do things and who they are, like God as creator, sustainer, healer, things like that. Just in a way that helps us not see things as so binary for people. And leadership does come in all of these forms and skills that we know. And so we should not be limiting what we think people are able to do based on what we believe to know about them. We want people to inform us on their own. We want them to be able to share who they are and what they bring as talents and skills and abilities and how that plays into the life of the church as well. And those are just some of our foundational affirmations for our work. Now, some of the harder things, we also understand as an agency that behaviors that we have, that we've learned over our whole lives, perhaps, they're based in attitudes, opinions, beliefs, and values that are learned. And that these can be very difficult to manage, to remediate, to change, because they are often sometimes at the core of who we are as people. And that doesn't mean that we can't change those things or that we can't open people's eyes to think differently or to be more open to ways of learning. But it just means that sometimes along the way, it can be challenging, and we have to be able to start with understanding that too. Other best practices relating to this type of work is suggesting inclusive alternatives. So that can be a strong way to promote healing when we do make mistakes, when we're in conversations or decision-making processes with people. And there's an opportunity for giving feedback immediately, and that can help identify behaviors that may not be appropriate, or how do we resolve language that we don't like in a conversation that we're having. All of that is part of our work as GCSRW, even though those things can be challenging, they can be hard, and they can be sticky. This is not easy stuff to deal with. So I hope you understand now that going into this, monitoring is not always the easiest thing to do, but it's so important because it helps everybody function and grow and learn together. And as people see our value, as people see our vulnerability, it's an opportunity for us to grow and learn from one another along the way. Because we're not perfect people. None of us are. So with those kind of foundational thoughts, we're going to look at what preparing for monitoring looks like. How do you even get started? Like, where do we start to begin thinking about monitoring, or for what event, and what does that look like? As soon as you have information about an event that's being planned, there are a number of things that you can do. So this could be for your annual conference, it could be for a large gathering that's happening of different types of people, wherever you are in your context. But one thing that I encourage is that you become part of the planning process. Firstly, there's often people that are volunteers doing this work, and they probably would welcome someone that's willing to be part of that. And when you, as an AC Cosro person or a monitor or a person that's involved in this type of justice work, wants to be part of the planning process, that allows you to get in at the ground level and to perhaps resolve some matters before we even get down the road. So you can be part of setting the foundation for moving forward. And sometimes that just means asking. It can't hurt to ask, hey, I heard this is coming. Would you like some help? Do you need some volunteers to assist with this? We'd be happy to participate to make sure that, we're being equitable in the planning of these things. One important thing that I'd encourage that we've been piloting and testing out in several annual conferences is if you hear that there's an event being planned, reach out to whoever's planning it and see if they might not be willing to have optional demographic questions for registration forms. And so when you think of general conference or these larger gatherings where people are constantly introducing themselves with their demographic information, we've tested it out in my own annual conference in Louisiana where people can submit their registration form and select all the demographic information ahead of time. It's optional. People don't have to do it. But in my annual conference, most people just filled it out. And that allowed for them to not have to introduce themselves every single time they spoke at the microphone, because I could just go find their name and fill in that data and track it later. And so that essentially would make your job easier as a monitor. So if it is possible to get in at the ground level and ask for things like that, it can cut out some of that clunkiness that people experience at the annual conference and higher level. And I think that a lot of groups would be more open to that because they feel like it interrupts the flow. And if there's a way that you can still be a monitor and get your work done without having to do that technical piece of everybody speaking and introducing over and over, I think that's a win-win for everybody. Earlier things you should do as well are requesting time for monitoring reports. You all probably know that for large events, you may not have very big windows where you can give out information. And sometimes you'll get 2 minutes or 6 minutes or 7 minutes in a 4-day period when you can give a report. And if you can, at the beginning of the planning, say, hey, we want to be able to do these monitoring reports, which we'll talk about later, that might be something that could be helpful. So they aren't surprised that the AC Cosro or whoever wants to give a report on their monitoring is going to ask for that. And so when I say it might be a recurring request, that might just be like, oh, annual conference is coming again. Let me reach out to the design team and ask for my 4 minutes every single morning. And that's something that you could start out with. Another way to gather information about inclusiveness is to conduct a survey prior to the event. And I'll show you what a model of this looks like later, but it's something that you would want to build into the registration process, an optional survey that talks about different questions about Do you feel like you're being included? Or where have you seen good or bad things happening in your annual conference? Just as examples. If people aren't feeling comfortable with submitting the demographic information, something like this that is anonymous might help them feel more comfortable. So again, this goes back to your context and what that looks like for you, because we're not all on the same page, not in the United States, not across the central conferences or anything like that. So 3 months before the event, you should be recruiting your volunteer monitors. And this is going to differ depending on how many people you need for the number of people that you're trying to monitor. For example, if you've got an annual conference and you've got 100 people, for example, you might want a person for every 25 people or for every quadrant of the room or something like that. Or maybe you've got a group of 30 people you're trying to monitor. It might just take one or two of you. So those are things that you can be thinking of along the way. And if you've established a team, like an annual conference COSRO, you can regularly have a list of people that might be willing to go in and monitor in different situations. That way, not one person is ever carrying this burden by themselves. So you recruit your volunteers and then perhaps you do a monitoring training. Maybe you watch a recording. Maybe you have me come virtually and I'll train you all. Whatever that looks like for you based on what you need, we can talk about that. And then, of course, you want to familiarize yourself with this packet and resources that we're talking through. And as time gets closer to the event, we're 1 month out. You need to have that monitoring training so that it can be fresh in people's minds, so that they can feel confident in what they're doing. And we'll go through some of that soon. But there's also some things that I recommend setting up. For example, we're going to call it an anonymous feedback loop for celebrations and concerns. This is just a way for people to report information to you all as monitors. So that can be a QR code with a survey that people could fill out on their phones. That could be kind of like a suggestion box that people write notes down on and leave them in there. Or perhaps they find a way to talk to you in person. But some people really appreciate having that anonymity of sharing because sometimes it's not always good or happy stuff that they want to share. So we'll talk more about that feedback loop later, but this is something that you should be building before the event actually happens. And then, of course, we're going to look at monitoring worksheets in a little while, but you will probably need those in hard copy depending on your context. Or if you want to use them virtually, you're certainly welcome to do that as well. So you want to have those ready for your team members. Perhaps that looks like putting them in folders and providing pens and paper. Perhaps that just means sharing a document on Google or something like that for people to access. There are a number of ways to do this. So that's just like what the planning process looks like to the event. And then when you get to the event, you want to make sure that way to provide feedback is live and usable. One of the most important things I hope for is that you bring a sense of peace to the monitoring process. The word monitoring in today's world feels a little heavy. It feels like Big Brother-ish sometimes. We want monitoring to be understood as a way of perceiving barriers and overcoming them, and helping people understanding that monitoring isn't shaming, finger pointing, blaming, or anything like that. Bringing the sense of peace to really vulnerable conversations and tough content is going to be really important. So that means practice your listening ear and absorbing information as you hear it and just not reacting and responding in a way that wouldn't feel like an appropriate response to someone who's having a challenging time. And also, while you're monitoring, you're going to be doing the actual monitoring itself, but then providing those daily reports. And you may have time to share from the front of the room. If not, there are other ways for you to share this information. You can share it on a social media post or in kind of a daily newsletter for the event, depending on your scope. But there are ways that you should be able to share this information with those who are attending, those who can't be there, and those who are curious about what's happening in the space where your event is. Then after the event, after you've done a wonderful, amazing job at the monitoring, we hope that you'll share your findings with us by emailing that information to us. We hope that you'll debrief with your team because you'll want to talk about what went well, what hasn't gone so well, and how we can improve for next year. And you also want to be able to share this information with the event leaders. Here's what we learned. Here's what we heard. Here's what we encourage you to do in the future that changes things for better. And of course, we want you to thank them as well. And so that's just looking ahead at like the timeline of what you should be doing and when you should be doing it along the way. Now, while you're going through the monitoring process, there are probably going to be situations where you hear, experience, witness, see other things that maybe don't feel so good. Maybe they don't feel very equitable. There is a section in this how-to monitoring toolkit that goes over foundational definitions. For example, you can see here explicit bias. Those are attitudes or beliefs that we have about others on a conscious level. So, a person publicly stating that they won't hire people of a certain group. um, you hear that, you know it doesn't feel good, you don't know what to call it. Maybe there's something in our foundational definitions to help put name to those things. And there's probably 18 or 20 definitions on that section. So it's things that you probably are familiar with from your lived experience, but now you have a way of calling it out or explaining to other people what that is. And that helps you prepare for, again, some of the things that you might see, experience, or witness along the way. Now, I keep talking about monitoring, but we should be talking about the perfect scenario of how you can be monitoring, right? So, the conditions that support monitoring. When we walk into a monitoring situation, it's important for people to know and understand that we aren't perfect people, right? And we can be hurtful to others. Sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's not. But regardless, we can seek forgiveness and we can learn from that experience. Both the people that happen to be perpetrating harm and those that are witnessing it are learning from it. So, just setting everybody on the same ground level can be really helpful. We also want to make sure that we create an environment of knowing that we aren't perfect and that we're going to make mistakes. And so, how do we learn from those together? How do we move forward? And what does that look like? And then our third condition is being kind when we're talking about the harm. We're not going to make assumptions that anybody did anything intentionally to harm someone. It might feel like it. That may be true, or maybe they did, but we don't want to assume anything. And so be kind. We never know what people are experiencing or where they're coming from. And while it may not be right, we can do our best to help them through that and to help others along the way. Now, when we are monitoring, as monitors for GCSRW in any situation, our primary goals are to observe opportunities to serve and opportunities to participate. And so those are areas when we typically see the most disparity or exclusion. And so serving is being considered for leading a conversation. Maybe that's in a legislative group. Maybe it's from the dais or, the front of the room or something like that. Being visible and being in authority or opportunities to participate. So, who is participating and how are they participating? Do they have all the tools that they need? What does that look like? So, those are the main categories of what we're looking for when we talk about monitoring. And we're going to talk about a few examples of what that means. So, opportunities to serve. Who is elected as a leader of the committee? For example, who's the chairperson? Who's the note taker, the secretary person? Does the chair share time with others, especially if there's more than one leader? We often see disparities between women and men, or racial ethnic persons and white people. So we want to make sure that we're observing what this looks like. Does the chair of the committee provide opportunities at the podium to certain people and not others? Is there a person that has the opportunity to serve in a way while other people don't even have the chance, aren't even looked at, aren't even thought about, or anything like that? And then also, does the leadership of the committee reflect the breadth of voices and experiences in the larger body? For example, does everybody in the front look the same where the audience is a much more diverse group? Those are all questions about opportunities to serve and to lead. Now, when we think about opportunities to participate, that feels a little bit different. So this is who is recognized to speak, who can present, who is able to participate in processes, who is not, like who isn't present, who takes the opportunity to speak when they're not called on. And does this get allowed or does this get shut down? What are the differences here? Are people in certain parts of the room not ever looked at or called on to speak? Perhaps you're in a very large space and nobody ever on the right side of the room gets called on, for example. Or does the presider allow time for different types of people. So if we've got people that need translation, for example, or people that need sign language or other types of interpretation, does the leader of the room give space for that before calling on the first person that's raised their hand? Does the leader remind the group to be respectful of these types of differing needs? All of these things are about participation and if people are able to do that fully or not, and what those challenges or hurdles look like if not. So, how to monitor. We're going to actually get to the details of what you're here for, but the first things that you're going to want to do is gather your forms. And so I mentioned we've got this PDF document. We also have Word documents. And the reason we have Word formats is because I want you to be able to go into those forms and change the things that you don't like. If we don't use this language in our context, like let's take it out, or maybe you use a different terminology in your context and you want to add that in there. That's why we've got Word documents that you can go in and change up in ways that you feel are appropriate. So just know that you have that ability to do. And as we look at how we're doing the monitoring, we're going to look at some of the forms, including the request for registration data collection, which we mentioned earlier, an opening report to the people that are going to hear from you the first time, our daily monitoring sheets, and the options that you have there, as well as the daily reporting out that you can do in a template form. So I just have screenshots of what these look like on the slide, and you can scroll through them at your own leisure later. Now, I mentioned how helpful it is to have somebody be willing to allow you to have registration data collection. So there is a template letter in this how-to monitoring guide where you can fill this in with your information. Dear so-and-so, my name is Reverend Katrena King. I'm representing the Annual Conference Commission on the Status and Role of Women. I heard about this event that's coming up, and we are going to be monitoring for gender inclusion and report those findings back to this event. And then we've got all this templated information about why monitoring is important, what the purpose is, and here is a recommended breakdown of the demographic information that we hope you might include in registration. And so over our last quadrennia, these are so far the best practices that we have in place right now. So we want people to put registration in for gender, race, ethnicity, age, status, and disability. And so here are some examples of what those categories can look like for people who've never built a form like this before. And then you can sign off at the end, whoever you are, on behalf of the monitoring team. And this is something you can just send over to the leadership and see what they say. They might say, yes, we love that. We're happy to do it. It helps streamline our work, and that's what you want to. So this is really a plug and play that you can go in the Word document and plug in your own information here. And if you don't like my language or you want to wordsmith it at all, like that's totally your prerogative. You have the Word document to be able to do that. And so again, this is from your early days of planning as soon as you hear about this event that you want to monitor. Opening report. This is a template for the first time that you address the group, if you're given the opportunity. And so here you can plug in the information. If you're at the Louisiana Annual Conference, my home conference, on this day in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, my name is Reverend Katrena King. I am an Asian female young adult, a clergy person representing the AC Cosro. You can plug in your information, and we use that in a template form of the way that you would have people introduce themselves if they were doing it out loud. And so that kind of sets the tone for that model. And then this is a script that you can basically read to the plenary or to whoever the group is that you're addressing, explaining what monitoring is, why it matters, some things that you can expect along the way, and why it's important. And you're essentially also bringing greetings on behalf of the board of directors on the General Commission on the Status and Role of Women with our president, Bishop Dolores J. Williamston. And then, of course, you can just thank the group and say that you'll be seeing me every day as I give out my reports. And if that's not something that you're able to do, you change the language to make sure that it fits your context. We've been given this time. We hope that you'll follow our social media page so you can see our reports. Whatever it looks like for you, find a way to invite people to participate in what this looks like. Monitoring sheets. Now, for those of you that are familiar with monitoring in the past, this is going to look a little familiar to you, but there's also some additional pieces and we've rephrased things in certain ways, so just buckle up. We have monitoring sheets for several different spaces. We have worship and ordination service sheets, which take place exactly like they sound for worship and ordination. And for both our worship ordination sheets and our session sheets, we have two options. We've got an X tracking sheet and a circle tracking sheet, and you're about to see the difference between those things. And they're just stylistically different. You might just prefer one over the other, and we've seen people modifying these over time. So I just wanted to give you multiple options that you can utilize along the way. And then we also have observation sheets. So worship ordination service sheet. This is the X tracking sheet. That just means that you're plugging in X's in the columns for the people that you're hearing from. So for example, you're filling out the top so you know what's happening when and where. What event is this? Louisiana Annual Conference. What is the date? Who is observing this? That would be me or you, whoever. What time are you starting this and what time does this end? And along the way, you're going to be plugging in information in this sheet. So every time someone speaks during worship or ordination service, you'll write down their name. Hopefully, you know who those people are. If not, you can have other people helping you do this. The bulletin may inform you as well of the order of worship of who's speaking and doing what. These people may not be, most likely will not be doing introductions of who they are through a worship service, but likely you've been through some plenary situations or you have that background data, so you're able to identify some of these pieces of who people are. So Katrena King is speaking. My district doesn't matter so much for this, so you can leave it blank if you want to, but I'm a female, so I'd put an X under F. And there's a little abbreviation key in the middle of the page in case you forget what the abbreviations are. I'm an Asian, so I'd put an X in the A box under the race ethnicity category. I'm a young adult, so you can put age there. Status, I'm a clergy person. Disability, yes or no. That is a harder category that if people aren't self-identifying, we don't tend to fill out as much because the best practice is having people tell you who they are. We don't want to make assumptions about them. So that is probably one of the most challenging parts of monitoring is if people aren't introducing themselves with demographic information, if you don't have any background survey information, you do the best you can. Even though we hate to make assumptions, we sometimes have to start in that place. And so that's why it's important for people to understand what monitoring is and why it matters so that they can share who they are instead of us making it up as we go. But sometimes we do have to make it up as we go to the best of our ability in a way that makes sense. And so then after Katrena speaks, you move on to the next person, Bishop so-and-so. And they are this and this and this and this and this. And then whoever else speaks along the way. Typically for worship ordination service, you may just need 1 or 2 pages of this. So I encourage you to print out like 2 copies so you can write on the front and back if you need to. But other things that we want you to observe during these services is inclusive language or imagery. So when whoever's preaching, whoever's praying, when someone's reading scripture, language for God, like are we using only male terminology for God? So was that inclusive or not? We'd say yes or no. What about the hymns? Is the language of the hymns that we're singing, feeling exclusive or using language that's outdated or things that we don't like in best practice anymore? And words for humans too. So those are all things that we can be thinking about along the way. And you can scribble notes down there about what you see or hear. And then do you recognize any trends around the services so far? What does that look like? Does the leadership of the service reflect who's in attendance? And then anything else you'd like to note. And so you are just to do the best that you can for this opening worship service, for the ordination service, or for whatever it is in whatever setting you're looking at. And we'll learn along the way that this isn't a perfect process, but this is a framework that we've started with. And so we do our best to practice this. So this is the X tracking sheet. This is the circle tracking sheet. It is almost identical, but instead of you writing an X in different spots, you're just circling the demographic information that you like. So again, this is just a stylistic preference. Again, Katrena King is speaking. Circle F for female in that row. Circle A for Asian in that row. Circle young adult in that row. Circle clergy in that row. and then any other notes that you want to do. And so it's just very simple difference. Blank, pre-filled. And so just going back and forth to those as options. And people just like to do it in different ways. So you have options now. Now, when we're doing your standard monitoring in a plenary session, like you're at annual conference and people are speaking from the microphone on the floor, people are speaking from the leadership, from the dais, this form is a little more streamlined. We've got the information at the top you want to fill out and complete, like who are you, where are you, what's happening, what day. And that's because this might be a multi-day event. If you're at annual conference, it might be 3 days or shorter or longer. And so you need to keep all this in order for when you're aggregating your data later. But again, you're writing down who's speaking, perhaps their district. Sometimes that matters more in your annual conference. Gender, race, ethnicity, age, status, disability. Now, if you have the registration data available to you, you need to write down their name and you can fill in all that other information later because they may not say it out loud. They don't need to. If there's not pre-registered information, perhaps they're introducing themselves by all of these things. And so at that time, you're just putting little X's or check marks or whatever symbol you want in the boxes that are appropriate. And then at the bottom, you'll see, the very bottom, you'll see the abbreviation key, but there's also questions around who is the presider, who is seated on the stage in the front, who has presented this session, any other comments to observe or to note. And so you would list all the people that are speaking, whether from the stage or from the floor, and they can all just go in this list together. And this you can make multiple copies of. You'll need it for different days. You might need several copies for one day. And here's what the flip side version of this looks like. The circle tracking form. Same thing. All of this information's being plugged in. But the one thing I haven't mentioned is you should be totaling at the bottom. How many females have spoken today? How many males? How many non-binary people? How many every other category on this sheet have spoken today? And sometimes you'll have nobody, you'll have blanks, and that's okay because not everybody's annual conferences or groups look the same, but this does help us understand some numbers, some percentages, some data. Now, alongside those monitoring sheets, we've got this longer observation sheet. And this is something I encourage you to fill out kind of as the session is wrapping up or immediately after, because I want these things to be fresh in your mind. So, of course, who are you, where are you, what's happening, when and where? And then, were there observations of inclusiveness or exclusiveness? Yes or no? Write down examples, such as gender, race, ethnicity, nationality, the presider's inclusiveness or exclusiveness of people. Were there comments or questions of racial, ethnic participants, women, young adults, or people with disabilities treated differently than other people, perhaps? What did that look like? Were people with translators given enough time? Is there a particular group of people who dominated the discussion who hasn't spoken? And then are people trying to speak on behalf of others that aren't able to speak for themselves? Are there things you want to celebrate about this session? Because monitoring isn't just about the inequities and the challenges that we see. Monitoring is also like, hey, we did this really well and we should be proud of that. And then questions about people with disabilities. Are there additional ways for people to engage? For example, large print options, sign language translators, closed captioning. Is there space in the aisle for people that are differently able to be able to get through? Can people with limited mobility have access to those microphones, et cetera, et cetera? And if there's other things that you witness, observe, or hear, you can drop that in the very bottom, kind of a catch-all category for things that you've seen. So this is kind of a more holistic view of what you've observed during the session. And I do recommend that you do one of these after every session that you're monitoring because things may change. Now, you would take all the information that you saw and wrote down on these observation sheets and these session monitoring sheets, and you're going to create a daily report. And this is a template. I believe that there's a template as well as a completed report for you to see an example of what that looks like. But you're plugging in where this is, what day it is, and then you want to introduce yourself, perhaps. And then here is what we heard or saw or found. You might introduce who your monitors are and, whether they're lay people or clergy people or where they're from or anything like that. But most importantly, you're going to talk a little bit about the data. So we noted the following. We saw 25 men and 4 women spoke. We heard that 10 white people, 5 people of color, and 1 multiracial person spoke. Everybody that spoke was over the age of 50. Anything like that that you want to put in here. And these are observations that the people that you're speaking to may not be so aware of, or perhaps they are, but they need someone like you who's gathering the data to share that back with them. But it really helps for a self-awareness and understanding about who is serving, who is leading, who is participating. And also, like, maybe I'm taking up too much space, or maybe I need to not speak as many times, or maybe we need to let more of the women speak, or more of the laity speak, or whatever it looks like. Whatever the data says helps you paint that picture and helps you guide that story a little bit. And so you're going to have a daily report that looks a little different or perhaps looks similar, depends on your context. And so this is a template that you can use to share that back with the people that are involved. And so again, I'm not showing it tonight, but there is a completed daily report. I think I used my own annual conference again in Louisiana and just gave some model examples of what this looked like and how that was shared with them. And so this is to help start telling the story. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like shortly. Best practices for gathering and sharing information. You'll find this in the How-To Monitoring Toolkit as well. We'll look at these inclusiveness questions, the feedback loop, and crafting a narrative. And so there's a section in the toolkit on each of these things, but I'll just show you a couple of highlights. Sample inclusiveness questions. If you are giving a survey, if people are not doing registration information, you can include demographic questions as part of a survey instead. That way it feels more anonymous to people, for example. Do you hold a leadership position in your church? Are you aware of any sexist behaviors or systemic structural sexism in the whatever annual conference? Whether that's something that you've seen yourself or something you've heard from others. Have you personally experienced anything like this? And so these are sample questions. I used sexist behaviors because we're talking about gender and GCSRW, but you can change that to anything you like depending on what information you're trying to gather. And so this is just a starting point. So you don't have to create this out of your brain on your own. You can add more questions. I recommend keeping it short because if you're trying to get volunteers to fill out surveys, the shorter the better, but you do want it to be information that you find to be useful and helpful along the way. Now, I mentioned this feedback loop opportunity, whether that is a quick QR code someone can scan and they can fill out these 3 questions, or it's a suggestion box that people are writing things on. And I did borrow this from an AC Cosro, so if that was you, thank you. But the questions that they shared as part of their monitoring were, when did you experience or witness success relating to equity, diverse representation, wholehearted acceptance, and grace? So like the good stuff. What did we see that made us feel proud? What did we witness that felt really good? And then there's the more challenging question. When did you experience or witness marginalization, contempt, insult, or bigotry? And then is there anything else you'd like to tell us? Because sometimes people want to say, I saw this, I don't know what to do about it. Can I tell you? This is an example framework of what that can look like. So kind of the good, the bad, and like an open question. And this is just an opportunity that I encourage you to have throughout the event that you're at, just a way for people to share information with you without having to tell you face to face. Because again, sometimes this stuff is not fun, easy stuff to talk about. Sometimes it's traumatic. And so I also provided in the packet some sample feedback loop responses that you might receive, just so you're kind of understanding what this could look like. So when did you experience some good things? The presider used a culturally insensitive phrase during a session. They later brought it up and told everybody and apologized, explained what this meant and why it was offensive and why they're not going to do it again, essentially. And so that's an example response here. During the session, the presider realized there wasn't enough aisle space for someone in an electric wheelchair to approach the microphone. So they paused the session to make sure all of the microphones were accessible by wheelchair, and then talked about inclusion as being important for the church's work, and then let that person who was going to speak speak. For the challenging things, when did you experience contempt, insult, or bigotry. I noticed that the white clergy and clergy of color didn't sit together. I heard someone say that they didn't have time to deal with these silly women's issues when there are bigger problems to solve, for example. And then, is there anything else you'd like to tell us? This weird catch-all category. Monitoring team's doing a great job. Keep up the good work. I'm concerned that no one on this side of the room's been called on. Can you share this information with the presider? So it can be like, it can be praise, it can be challenges, it can be information that people should know. And this is an opportunity for people to share that information. Now, I mentioned data, I mentioned numbers and technicalities, and how I want you all to be able to practice storytelling alongside that. And so, like, the best practice is striking that balance between data and storytelling. And so, when you're trying to shift from a data mindset into storytelling, there are 5 things in the how-to toolkit that I hope you'll read about thinking differently. So, again, shifting from numbers to stories and what that looks like, knowing your audience. In particular, we're talking about a religious institution, and so grounding things in theology is really, really helpful. Being memorable, so that means storytelling, right? Sometimes you hear numbers or data that is shocking, but it's always easier to remember a story that you heard about something that was meaningful or harmful. So be open to telling those things in different ways, just like using visuals. So you have numbers, you have counts of people, perhaps, putting those into visual format, whether that's a chart or some other kind of representative visual aid that helps people understand what exactly is happening or what that looks like. And then, of course, practice makes progress. We're not always going to be the best skilled people at storytelling, but as we continue to learn how to do it, we'll get better and better at it. So I want you all to be open-minded as you step into this new space. And so I've given you examples in the packet of how to craft a narrative. So for example, if you have information that is about the worship service and you see that you have 4 Black people and 5 white people, you have 6 males and 3 females, you have 7 clergy and you have 2 laity. And then you also received a comment from someone that is, my grandchild attended opening worship with me and said, "Why isn't there anyone up there who looks like me?" This really gave me pause. How can we be more inclusive of different cultures so that all people feel welcome? So you have that. The story you could tell might look a little bit like this. Scriptural grounding, our favorite, Galatians 3:28 states, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, nor slave nor free, nor there is male or female, for all of you are one in Jesus Christ." And while those are only a few examples listed here, what the scripture is trying to say is that all persons have value in the sight of God. And as we do the work of monitors, it is our job to raise awareness to those things that keep us from feeling that value. And then you can talk about inequities and what that means. And so here we've given some charts that are going to help people understand what this looks like, who might be missing, where can attention be more paid, how can we be more inclusive. Based on the data you have, only 1 woman leads for every 2 men. Our racial ethnic breakdown looks a little more equal than it has been before. And we also know that laity make up more of the church, but here only 2 of them shared. So for example, as you're telling these stories, you can show these charts, which basically show the data that you just talked about. So for every male that spoke, two males that spoke, 1 female spoke, or the equity between white and Black races coming to be more equal in this situation. We've got status, clergy, and laity here. Again, it looks like the clergy are taking up more space than laity. And then you can talk about that story that someone shared with you in an anonymized way, just saying that a person shared that they went to the worship service with a young relative and they asked why no one looked like them, and how that question should give us pause because young people are the future of the church and the world. How can they know that they can be leaders as well? And so kind of crafting the storytelling around this one incident that happened to somebody based on what you heard. And so the only ways you're going to be able to share stories like this is if you have a way to gather that information, if you create a sense of openness for people to have conversation with you, as well as to be gathering the data and monitoring in the first place. So that's just one example. There's another example here as well. Like, here's some data you have, what the comment looked like, and then how you can tell a story relating to that, some example graphs and charts. And again, I literally wrote out a script of things that you could say, for example, in that situation. So just ways to understand how to story tell about what numbers look like, right? When you've got a four and an eight and a one and a six, how does that actually apply to the people that are in the room with you? And what does that mean? What does that look like? People are going to be more likely to remember those things and those pieces. So this is the training for monitoring information. You'll find this towards the end of the how-to toolkit. There will be ways to contact us, and I'll mention we'll do trainings in person. We'll do trainings virtually. You can watch recordings. And then we also offer workshops and skill building alongside monitoring. Like we could do a workshop on finding your voice or empowering the silenced or crafting a narrative when you don't have a creative bone in your body, all of those kinds of things. And so that's just a page to remind you of what that looks like. And then you've got a beautiful appendix that has all of these sample documents in it and what pages they're on, so you can quickly find your way. Again, this is part of the PDF document. But wait, for those of us that are not as happy with dealing with a PDF document, I have built a more user-friendly, self-guided training as well. And so this is called the Articulate, like that's the name of the platform that we use. And so I took all of the information from the how-to guide in PDF form and loaded it into this platform where you can click through and learn in a slightly different way. So again, this is about preference, like maybe you like to have something tactile that you're reading through, you print it out, you mark it up. Maybe you like to learn on virtual platforms. Well, now you have a choice. And so I'll just show you quickly what that looks like. This is the landing page. Each of those sections that we have in the how-to toolkit in the table of contents, you can click through and you'll see a quick overview of what each section is for. When you're looking at the timeline for monitoring, you've got checklists for each section that you can go through and check as you read them, so you feel like you're moving forward. And then the definitions page, you've got little flashcards, so you can read about what those words are and what they mean, and they flip over and you can reverse them and practice them. We've got monitoring, observing for serving and participating, a little bit about bias in that conversation. And so we already looked at what some of these look like on our slide deck today, but here you can click through in some tabs to read them in a different format. Same information, just different spot. And then also we've got those monitoring Word documents on the articulate, so you can click on them there one by one for easy access. And I'll just pause because I've talked a lot about a lot of different things. And before I open it up for questions, I just wanted to offer that this is a high level training. This is for you to understand that we have tools and resources available to you, but I am available to train your annual conference COSRO by having a Zoom with you on a Tuesday night to talk through, like practicing how to mark this information down, how to set up the things that you need to build. And so this isn't meant to be completely comprehensive. It's just meant to get you a starting point. And I want you all to know that you have different contexts. You might be looking at other things beyond annual conference or different types of meetings. And all of this can be tailored and shifted to do that work because it's really important for everybody in the church to be part of observing who's participating and who's leading and who's serving in different ways. And of course, making sure that those who often aren't seen or aren't lifted up have the opportunity to be part of those conversations. So I'll pause here and see if there's any questions that I can field for you all. And to that end, if you have ideas or you have feedback on things that have worked, that haven't worked. Maybe you want to take this and try it out and then bring back some ideas or perfect some things. We would love to help you with that work. So, Rose, no, there's not a cost to the training within the scope of the United Methodist Church. It is our mandate to do this work. And so you would just reach out to me at my email address and we can coordinate a time that makes the most sense to do one of those trainings. Any other thoughts or questions? Thank you all so much. I'm happy to stick around for a few more minutes, but again, this it has been recorded. There are going to be other ways to plug in additional trainings to go, and if you need an annual conference training, just reach out to me. Um, I would say both and Susan. So I would aggregate all of the data. I would do those daily reports to kind of share with the body what's happening. And then I would give a final report because you may see like on our first day, here was our bottom line. And then by day three, we'd look like this. And then report that out to the people that you've shared with, and then also give that back to us. Because we're trying to get a handle on what it looks like in each annual conference. And to Tessa's question, best way to submit your findings, email directly to me or info@gcosro.org. We had some trouble with the Dropbox this year, and so we're just looking at different ways to do that moving forward, Tess. And we will probably send out reminders in the summertime or later in the fall to remind you if you haven't yet submitted your annual conference reports. Please do that. Getting it late is better than never, and so we're just gonna do our best to reach out through our platforms and our emails to remind you of what you have already done probably and just need to send it over to us. Well, I appreciate you all on a Tuesday night. It's two after the hour, so I'll release you all into doing whatever the things you are that you need to. But please know that I'm available. Like monitoring is in my title, it is part of my entire job. And so I'm happy to have any kind of conversations with you about what monitoring looks like or how to do it in your context. Y'all have a wonderful evening. That sounds great. I look forward to hearing from y'all. Yes, Edgar, we can do that. We may also send out an email bump or a social media post sharing that information. But I'm going to take your name down and see if I can't pull your email and then make sure that you get it. And you mean the slide deck? Yeah, I'm happy to send the slide deck and the recording to all of you. Perfect. Absolutely, Susan. Certainly happy to send you the recording, and that way people can watch it on their own time, and then maybe you could bring them together to do some practices together, or I could do a training, something like that. It's always great to like let people get familiar and then try to do it in practice. Well, I'm happy to make sure that you do get a training, Susan.